Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from clinical development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhood. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
On today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader, we're excited to welcome Adriana Valenciano, one of Ramin and my colleagues with SSI. In our last episode, we met with Dr. Oz Assam, where we really talked about the introduction of a new class of medicine and what it takes to build something new in the biotech industry, as well as some of the organizational agility and flexibility that you need to design inherently in order to really bring this new class of medicine to market. So Adriana has had a really great opportunity to collaborate with Oz, as well as a number of other leaders in the industry doing new things in gene therapy and in other areas. So we're really excited to welcome her to this conversation. So Adriana, thanks for joining.
Oh, thanks both for having me. This is very exciting.
Welcome.
So one of the things that I wanted to start the conversation on is really to talk about this new class of medicine and what it means to drive something new in the market. We at SSI have had a great opportunity to work with gene therapy organizations 7-8 years ago. Ramin is a great testament to that at his time at Avexis. We've moved into the digital therapeutic space a number of years ago, really driving a new class of medicine there. And Oz really expanded on this entirely new class of medicine at this intersection of neuroscience and psychiatric disorders and really what they're doing with psilocybin. So would love for you to maybe opine on what's really different about the work going on in Empyrean, from what we can talk about, as well as just what it means and what's a little bit different going on there and driving innovation.
Absolutely, Kim. And thanks for raising it. I first want to start by just saying Oz has had really an enviable career, I would say, in both large pharma and biotech. So it was amazing to see what he's accomplished, what he's taken away from each of those experiences. And I think that is what actually has lended himself well to this space of innovation and really bringing him to Empyrean with a really discrete sense of how he wants to drive innovation and bring this product to the market. I think that, as you mentioned, at SSI, we've had the opportunity to be at the forefront of those early innovations, both in cell and gene, as well as digital and many others. And what we've noticed across the board is that leaders need to lend from their experiences in the past, think about it creatively and run with it. And I think Oz is someone who he's bringing in his experience from cell therapy. He's bringing in experience from small molecule that he's had. And he's also looking at the therapeutic area, the psychiatric space, what's been happening there, as well as neurology. So I think that when you're approaching these new innovative areas, you have to kind of lend from what you've learned in the past, pick up from other areas or disciplines that you feel are tangential. Oz is going the road untraveled. Like, he is genetically modifying plants and creating human therapeutics. There's nothing like that in the market. So he really has to draw from his experience, like I said, in cell and gene. Also, kind of getting into the botanical space, which is an area that is really, really just kind of untapped, particularly from the FDA side of things. So I think that as a leader in this space and as an innovator, you have to try and draw from other areas that could kind of bring to light new paths, and see if you can bring something new from what has been done in small molecules to botanicals.
One of the really interesting points that Oz brought up in terms of the story for Empyrean is that it's really operating at this intersection of neurology or neurosciences and psychiatry in this really interesting space where there are a lot of treatments for patients with things like depression, but they're not really working as effectively as we would like. And we know that there's this really important connection between pure neurology and neuroscience and the psychiatric space. We've seen a lot of innovation coming recently. We're seeing, some of this in digital therapeutics where companies are really leaning in. Empyrean's taking a whole new lens on it. And Adriana, I would love for maybe you to give us some insight into what's really unique about this intersection and this space and how we're really thinking creatively about innovation specifically here to drive better outcomes for patients.
Absolutely, Kim. And it's honestly, psychiatry is one of those places or fields that it's just surprising that there hasn't been innovation for so many years. The first antidepressants were really approved in the 50s, and then SSRIs didn't come around until the late 80s. So it's just very surprising that there hasn't been more innovation in this space. Now, there is, Empyrean is not the only psychedelics company out there, but and they're all trying to address this highly unmet need of patients who are suffering from psychiatric disorders. Now, when it comes to bringing in this nexus of neuro and psych, I think it's the industry really finally tapping into this notion that psychiatry is only a part of what folks are facing, that these are neurological disorders as well. And how do we design and develop therapies that are addressing multifactorial disorders. So I think for a company like Empyrean that is trying to really address and hit multiple receptors to really kind of build that efficacy beyond what has already been seen with SSRIs is truly revolutionary. And they're doing it really with some highly innovative technology that has been used in other spaces. It's just never been applied in this way, particularly to plants. So I think that what we will see as many of these companies continue to get into the clinic is we're going to see really different endpoints and really different outcomes than what we've seen in trials for psychiatric disorders. We're going to see new ways of assessing efficacy. We're going to see really differences for the positive for patients. And it's not going to be just cookie cutter psychiatry studies. It's going to be different. And I think that's for the benefit of patients who have really been suffering for many years with suboptimal therapies available to them.
I'm so encouraged by that, knowing when we look at the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and how many people are finally looking for care and seeking that, and then hearing what Oz was referring to, which is how poor current treatments are at actually addressing this need, plus the lack of appropriate numbers of therapists and really truly burnt out psychiatric care in the US. It's so important to think about innovation and new offerings in the space to help patients. So thinking about different endpoints and different ways of innovation and what we're going to actually be able to demonstrate gives me hope that we're not going to be in the same cycle of doing the same thing over and over and hoping for a different outcome that we've seen in a lot of these areas. So I think that's incredibly encouraging for what creativity and innovation is really going to mean in this space.
It's interesting because I went to a conference recently where they were already talking about the next generation of psychedelics. We feel like we're at the forefront of the first, but there's already a second generation of optimization of what we already know is proving really valuable to patients, at least in clinical trials. So I'm similarly optimistic and also very encouraged because I think that this is an area that just has been so under-nurtured in terms of innovation, and people haven't been putting a lot of research dollars into it. The investment community is very enthusiastic about it, and taking a real second look at these organizations that are bringing, what some people say are non-traditional, but I hope is traditional therapy in the future. And it will change over time. And as we get more and more innovators in this space, hopefully we can get, the buy-in of payers and other types of access organizations to make it available, because it's certainly, at least from what the data has been showing in early clinical trials, there are really positive outcomes that we're seeing for patients in these areas.
I think it's so interesting. I always find this area so fun when we get to do something really new. I hate doing the lather, rinse, repeat thing over and over again, but every time we're brought into one of these new scenarios, there's a little bit of, I've seen parts of this before, and I kind of know what I'm doing, and I know how to apply the principles of what needs to happen. But there's this lens of creativity that you have to apply on everything you do. You have to be creative in terms of how you engage with regulatory bodies. You need to be really creative in how you start to tell a value story to early engagement with payers. You need to be really creative on how you're translating the clinical value to physicians and patients. And ultimately, patients are some of the hardest people to really convince, especially when you're doing something incredibly new. So would love Ramin and Adriana for both of you to chime in here. How do you think about this creative lens and where these blurry lines really form and where we can really innovate?
Yeah, it's interesting when Oz was talking about the phenotype for folks coming into an organization like Empyrean or any really biotech that's at the edge of innovation. I was surprised to hear that he didn't mention that, because for me, that's something that I know that he has, but I know that other leaders are looking for when they're trying to build out their teams. Is a lot of creativity. I think he mentioned like resilience and tenacity, which is definitely kind of tied in there to creativity, being able to push through and kind of be resilient in your points of view and in your direction, your strategic thinking, despite not knowing what's ahead. I mean, that's incredibly important. What I think, when it comes to creativity, I always think of really making sure that you have a broad base of opinion amongst your team. So folks with different backgrounds, with level of experience, can really help bring that creativity to a strategic planning of an organization. And that all comes down to the different phenotypes of the people you bring in. I know that for a company that's in that really early stage, more translational, less of the discovery, but really leaning towards kind of the end in mind with going to the clinic, having a strong translational leader is important that has that level of creativity, not just looking at what's been done in psychiatry from a clinical perspective, because the hope is to do more than what we've already done in psychiatry and what clinical trials have shown us there. So, I think that you're looking for someone who has maybe experience in the space, but that maybe has had some other, experiences outside of a specific therapeutic area, so that they can bring some different perspective. I know that for psychiatry, folks not only look at the traditional endpoints, but they're now also looking at different neurological endpoints that have been traditionally used in, very straight, narrow neurology studies. So if you bring in a leader who's really focused in one space and one therapeutic area, you might miss out on an opportunity to differentiate your product.
I think that's such an important point you bring up, Adriana. It's almost what you're saying is that you kind of in order to be creative and innovative, you also have to be willing to forget what you've already done and start thinking about how you can do things differently now. So that experience is great to have, but at some point it could become a hindrance because you're so fixated on what it has worked. And what I really like with our conversation with Oz, he was talking about how the old way of thinkings and the new way of the thinkings, and you have to decide where you are, what stage you are, what kind of a company, pharmaceutical, therapeutic area, are you bringing a completely new class to the market or not? And then based on that, you decide on your resource allocations, what kind of a phenotype do you need? Does the old way of linear algorithm thinking and just hiring works, or do you need to be more selective and strategic? And to your point, you also have to bring in people that are thinking and are willing to be creative, because that's a lot easier said than done, because usually when you're trying to be very new and creative and you try it, you're going to have a lot of more failures on your hand because you're the pioneers. How do you help our clients to go through all of that unknowns where they are really in the front and dealing with all these challenges from all different aspects? And obviously, hiring is a piece of it, but there are regulatory aspects, there are clinical studies, there's results, data, all of these things that are happening all at the same time. How do you work our clients through this whole process?
Yeah, Ramin, and I'm going to even layer something else on, which is like the investment environment. So it's, layering in the challenges of trying to identify what team makes sense for you at that time, and the pressure that you're facing to meet milestones and deliver on commitments. So I think Oz said, leaders are for seasons and teams are for seasons. And I think that that's really how we like to approach it with our clients early on, is that We don't need to build out a full-blown preclinical translational team, particularly if we're collaborating with strong folks in academia or with other CROs that are delivering on this important preclinical work. We need someone who has strong vision for the end in mind, for where we need to go and how do we design our program early on so that we can meet those milestones. So, when we're working with clients and when I'm working with clients, I look at some of the most, critical areas of their business that makes sense for them to keep in-house. I think Oz says, having his 9 folks that are really focused on focused in the lab, on the wet lab, that's critical because the science is so unique and discrete, versus kind of the build out of their translational and clinical, which is something right now that is in the future, but they need to plan for it now. He's onboarded a very experienced CMO, Fred Grossman, who's in psychiatry. So he is really laying the foundation, but they're building the scaffolding of their team around them of SMEs in areas that can help, push forward and operationalize a very discrete set of activities for their lead asset. So I think that, making that decision around platform versus asset, they have a robust platform, but they're focused on this asset. So I think that as an advisor to a client like this, I would say, what do we need to do to get this asset to our next milestone? And let's build a team around what is needed there. So I think it really just depends on the organization, but I always think about it, what are our milestones look like and how do we build a team around meeting each of those milestones one after the other?
It's a really great ad, Adriana, at the forefront of what you just described, that the investment community is also driving a lot of decision-making operationally within a lot of early stage biotechs. Just knowing where the money is right now, where it may or may not come from in the future, is really starting to color, should we or should we not actually hire? Does it make sense to build this entire function? And some of these roles might require, FTE level of resourcing, but not actually necessitate an internal resource. And it might make more sense to have a flexible team. It might make more sense to bring in partial skills across multiple people, especially in an area where you have to be so creative and you have to bring this meeting of minds. And I think one thing that I really enjoyed that we talked about last time is this diversity of experience and diversity of thought and how that really translates into the team. And a partial team that brings that diversity of thought, in my mind, in this environment, really trumps a single person who has a singular view of where to go. And so it's really interesting to hear the Empyrean story of how Oz is starting to build the organization, but also in my own experience, a lot of conversations I've been having with organizations recently are, what if I don't hire anybody for a year? What would that look like? How do I get these priorities done? And what are my options? And talk me through that so that I'm not worried about carrying the burden of an entire function or a team, which truly isn't necessarily core to my business. So to your point at Empyrean, the wet lab is core to the business. In a lot of these other organizations, it's figuring out which functions really are mission critical and how do I get all of that other work done and how do I get creative about that?
Yeah, that's totally right, Kim. And I think that, if you looked at some of our other clients that we've supported that let's say are in the more ultra rare disease space, they may be thinking about that FTE versus augmented model very differently. They may be focusing on actually having early on, let's say, a really core and prominent patient advocacy partner at the table from the start, because they realize the importance of building that community early on versus maybe having a full-blown, I would say, regulatory shop. Maybe they can leverage another partner to help bring that in early on to help map the regulatory path, but maybe an early hire looks like a patient advocacy or another function. I would also add probably a strong CMO or clinical leader is important for those types of organizations. So it really will just depend on what your core thesis is to your company and where directionally you want to go and that you've been driving investors around. So, I've had other companies who, when they're thinking about their hires, they'll be presented candidates, and they'll say too traditional, too, has done, the same thing, at many different companies, no diversity. And that's what people are looking for now. They're looking for diversity of thinking, experience, and they're building teams, that are not, as Odd described, like the person they met, at their last company. They're going outside of their networks, and they're looking for individualized experiences that will lend themselves to innovation. So I think personally that it's an exciting time for kind of putting those pieces together, and not just building a new class of medicine, but building new teams. And biotech is looking a lot different than many years ago.
Adriana, I know you work with all different sizes of companies and a lot of small startup and biotechs as well. And to the point that you were talking about candidates and the attributes and the phenotype of a candidate, and I asked the same question from Oz. Do you see it more challenging for startups and biotech to get the right talent in that is very well broadened and not just the experience in one therapeutic area, but they really have a good understanding across the drug development, commercializations, and how to bring a new class to the market? Is that challenging for smaller companies and biotechs to find those talents? What do you think?
I think that Oz said it best. There's a talent war right now, particularly if you're in kind of looking at genetic medicines. And I think that there's, with the changing climate and what's going on in large pharma, and restructurings and things, there's definitely folks that are out there, but organizations are being very selective because they themselves realize that they have cash runways to preserve, and they don't want to make the wrong hire because that can be really debilitating to the organization. So I think that certainly there is a competitive market, but there are great candidates out there. And what I'm seeing the best leaders doing is being more thoughtful about who they bring in, and not just necessarily sticking to spec, meeting candidates, testing their ability to be agile, to be creative, and not just think about things in a linear fashion. So that's where I'm seeing the struggles with hiring is more so finding the right candidates.
How do we fill that gap for them, Adriana, at SSI and your clients? How do you fill that gap where they're thinking about what talent or what position to even hire? How do we come in at SSI and help them out to fulfill that gap for them with the talents that we have at our company?
I think we do a really great job of testing assumptions around what they feel like they need. We oftentimes have folks and clients that come to us and say, I really need a preclinical person. I really need a strong clinical developer. And I think that while we're in the business, the client service business, we're also, first and foremost, partners to our clients. And we hope that we have clients that allow us to bring our perspective on what their hiring approaches can and should be. So we like to test those assumptions and really dig into what's going on at the organization and say, you're right, you may need a strong preclinical person to help manage these studies, but what you also need is a really strong translational leader who's going to make sure that what we are designing will work in the clinic. And we can help bring those experts to bear. But I'd be curious to hear from Kim as well about those early engagements when the client asks for one thing. How do we pivot in some ways to provide that perspective?
When we're asked for something in particular, I think the best option for us is always, we can always do versions of what they're asking. But to your point, Adriana, there's a lot more underneath the question. So in our engagements, it's really about doing that root cause analysis, understanding why they think they need this specific person, why they need, a head count in this role, when often it's really, I need somebody who can do a piece of that, but actually I also need that person to do 10 other things. And that's when we start to get into a conversation about skill and experience and less about a person. And when we can do that, we can provide a more holistic approach to different people that can fill very specific skill gaps can generally get to a much better and faster outcome for an organization that needs to be really agile, because we can plug into Adriana's point, that preclinical, that translational, the clinical mind, and we can have those pieces of that diversity of thought really collaborate to get to that outcome. And then over time, figure out, all right, well, which of these phenotypes actually make sense for an internal hire? And one of the things that I really lean into is, at what point is that hire actually sustainable? And by bringing them on board, are you substantially de-risking the business? If a hire can't answer one of those things, it may or may not make sense to actually make that hire near term, especially in this environment, especially in a growing biotech. So we really have to think about, is this sustainable? Does bringing this person on de-risk? And if not, how do I make sure I'm bringing those skills to bear so that I can get the work done and do it as quickly and agilely as possible?
Yeah, and I think Oz talked about it, how that model shifts over time. What works today will not always work in the future. And there are inflection points where, as you suggested, Kim, it does make sense to have that FTE onboarded and very clearly embedded in the organization versus an augmented model in previous iterations of the company. So I think that there's no like one or the other really, and I think organizations need to be really not pegged into, okay, well, I have FTEs now, will I need them forever, vice versa in terms of the consultants.
I think one area that I've also experienced on both sides when I was in the industry and now in the consulting is that rather than focusing on the FTE or the hire, focusing on the output. And it completely changes your perspective, right? What is the output I'm looking for? And then it opens up the door, well, how do I get there? Yes, one of them could be, I need to hire somebody with this experience. But then you also have to question yourself, well, how long do I need that experience? What stage I'm at? Focusing on the output, I think it helps you to also make a little bit broader and maybe more strategic decisions in your hiring. And there are plenty of great talents out there that you can also supplement your hiring in order to get to that end result. I think that helps quite a bit as well. Sometimes we get very fixated on, I have 6 headcounts, 20 headcounts, and I need to fill them. And there may be other approaches there as well.
I think maybe as a final thought here, a little personal anecdote. I always find myself over my morning coffee reading Endpoints and Fierce Pharma and all of these different morning news updates. And I do think what we're saying is starting to really resonate in the market. We are seeing such differentiated outcomes. We're seeing such innovation coming into the market. We're seeing organizations like Empyrean come out of stealth mode. We're seeing a lot of innovation and big deals happening in the gene therapy space, digital, really across the board. I have to assume, and we're hearing it and we're seeing it in our client organizations, that there really is this shift in mindset around the people that we're bringing into the table. How do we make sure that if this hasn't worked for 20 years, we're not hitting our heads against the wall and doing the same thing over and over again? We're finally seeing some of that breakthrough. So, from a personal perspective, I find it incredibly encouraging to see the innovation in the market and see our client organizations really start to make these changes and really see these outcomes, Ramin, that you're referring to. So, Adriana, really appreciate you joining the conversation today. And looking forward to future conversations.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on board.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.